Charities, nonprofits, social enterprises, and grassroots groups across the country are doing some of the most vital post-pandemic community recovery and resilience work. And yet, they're dependent on a business model and funding systems fraught with inefficiency, power imbalance, and, yes, oppression. Meet Ali. Ali is the executive director of an advocacy organization dedicated to ending environmental racism in Canada. Their team is small. Aside from Ali, only 3 others work full-time and they don't have a grant writer on staff. Ali's team spends all day, every day, meeting with communities targeted by environmental racism and bringing their stories to government officials, demanding change. Meanwhile, grant money's running out, they have a ton of reporting to do for existing funders, and they're not sure how they'll find the time to apply for more, with so much life or death work to be done. Still, Ali's organization's one of the lucky ones. They had the resources to become a registered charity eligible for philanthropic funding in the first place. Ali hears all the time from some of the fiercest grassroots and activist groups, often led by those most impacted by environmental racism, that can't even apply for any of Canadian philanthropy's billions of dollars in annual grant money because they're not registered charities. But there is a movement growing to change the way social purpose organizations operate, are funded, and valued. To flip the power dynamics between funder and grantee. To rewire the business models of community services. To rewrite the rules of philanthropy and social finance. To decolonize the whole system. And to make the social impact world, and most importantly the communities it serves, far more resilient than it was before the pandemic. Are you in?
Hi everyone, my name is Jenna Tenyuk. I'm a writer, speaker, and facilitator, and I'm grateful to be here with you today. Thank you to Future of Good for having me, and I will be sharing 2 poems with you. To be or not to be a minority, that is the question. A question I've been revisiting and trying to comprehend. From the outskirts, being a minority doesn't seem like the ideal position. Being different, perhaps a dissident, maybe exotic. And I'm all too familiar with these words and trends and haven't used them. But as I've come to understand and accept my story, this minority status has become a fallacy, a malicious status imposed on me, the dominant norms and ideologies that have bruised and broken me, boxing me into this tiny crevice of being a minority. So I've embraced and accepted being the token Asian, flaunting my Jamaican roots of being Chinese and Jamaican, despite not speaking Cantonese or Mandarin or fitting in or understanding anything. But with these white folks, it didn't matter because I met the quota and looked the part of the exotic, even though I was just as Canadian as the rest of them. But being a visible minority wasn't the part that bothered and ate away at me, but the forbidden and hidden pieces inside of me I locked away for no one to see. So I grew up Christian, going to church, going to Catholic school, doing all the things that good little Christian girls should do. I prayed sometimes, I read my Bible sometimes, and I tried to love all people. But secretly, there's some people I could not love because I grew up learning to hate them and what they did, living a life of sin and being an abomination. But the real reason I could not love them was because I was filled with self-hatred, judging and condemning myself the hardest. Because when you've been conditioned not to accept something, having this thing decay and eat away at your being, you create a put together image so no one would suspect anything, though behind closed doors, you lived a life of loneliness, despair, and isolation. And all you could do was project and point the finger at the other, simply to survive the lies of being a minority. And then you enter gender studies, where that other piece of you is harder to grasp, that you would follow God who many believed was against that part of you, and coming out as Christian is more of a shock than the parts you've hidden your entire life. You've opened yourself to new communities, but sometimes you feel you don't belong. because you look different, act different, can pass not visibly identifying with the stereotypes. You're trying so hard to break those internalized feelings that make you cringe every time you think them, and you wonder, will I be a minority forever? Sitting, thinking, overanalyzing, and questioning, finding everything overwhelming, especially these theories, querying your mind. So let's get this straight. How do you perform gender? Will I ever understand Judith Butler? How do you work within and against dominant ideology and disidentification theory? And is it okay if I'm just Jenna for 1 second? Because all I ever wanted was to fit in and belong. That longing in my heart, which was only expressed through poetry and song, revealing my struggles and pain, but never being able to name what they actually were. And these pieces of my identity, my spirituality, sexuality, and racial identity have been the parts that have caused the most heartache and headache, shaming and shaking me out of the norms, realizing I'm not really normal, even though I don't really know what that means, and nor do I want to be if it means boxing myself into heteronormativity, white supremacy, or whatever norms any queer community tells me I should be, trying to find the compatibility between these minorities, challenging, changing, transforming, shaking up these identities, hoping for a new one where it doesn't matter who I love, who I follow, or what I look like. And I can find peace in simply being me because I am sick and tired of being a minority. Thank you. So that's a bit of my story and some of the intersections that I live with and the complexities of our identities. And the next piece I'm going to share is called Dare White Supremacy. And I wrote this for today after a conversation I had with Katie and some of the themes that you will be exploring. Dear white supremacy, I am tired. I am tired of your lies that tell me I am not good enough. My communities aren't good enough. That I need to change and code switch. I need to be seen as articulate, working harder than any white person in the room just to get in the room. Maybe I'll be taken seriously. Maybe they'll listen to me as a queer woman of color if I'm lucky. The ways you have harmed me, the ways you have harmed Black, Indigenous, and other racialized communities through your colonial and paternalistic violence. Your positive intentions, what you see as good and helpful, without actually listening, learning, and consulting with our communities. We are not your charity. Check boxes for your diversity and equity, solidarity statements as you experience your racial awakenings. We have been here, speaking, fighting, resisting. But how long has it taken for you to stop and listen? Who is at your table? Who are the real decision makers? Who has power? Do they look like me? Do they get to tell their own stories? Stories of joy and power and resiliency? We are more than our trauma. We are more than your quotas. We are long past the status quo. The time to do something is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna, for the powerful opening performance. Jenna Tenyuk is a writer, speaker, and facilitator who believes in the power of storytelling to break silences, connect people, and change the world around us. You can learn more about Jenna's work in the link in the chat box. Welcome everyone to the highly anticipated Transforming Funding Models Summit. We have an incredible experience for you today and tomorrow, and I'm so pleased to welcome you. I'm a first-generation settler speaking today from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory in what is now known as Ottawa. I moved to Canada when I was about 9 years old from India, and I want to acknowledge the privileges I have as a settler through our colonial system, and there are many. One of the biggest settler privileges I've experienced since moving here as a kid, and something I really took for granted growing up, is that I've been able to be connected to my language, my traditions, my cultural foods, and my cultural practices, to my elders. And these settler privileges are the result of colonization and systemic harm. And as a settler, I continue to unlearn and relearn every day. And here at Future of Good, As a team, we believe that in order to dismantle oppressive systems and work towards reconciliation, we need to become educated and aware of the teachings, the triumphs, and daily realities of Indigenous communities. My name is Vinod Rajasekaran. I'm publisher and CEO of Future of Good. Our mission is to enrich changemakers like you every day with smart coverage of the social impact world. Today, we have a range of people joining us from across the country. We have philanthropic funders, social service agencies, impact investors. We have global development and humanitarian organizations, nonprofits and charities of various kinds, cooperatives, social enterprises, think tanks, universities, colleges. We have corporate CSR teams, governments, and others. But why are we here? We are here today because we want our teams to thrive coming out of COVID. We want our missions, our services, our governance, and our programs to flourish so we can enhance lives. We want to boost our team's resilience in a changing world. In our last 15 or so months of covering social impact during COVID, we've seen some trends. Changemakers are asking themselves slightly different questions. Executives and boards are asking, can the funding model and the strategic plans that sustained us before COVID sustain us moving forward? Staff and social purpose organizations are asking, can the programs and operating models that sustained us before COVID sustain us moving forward? And even funders are asking similar questions, like, why are we tied up in a business model that's actually creating and perpetuating inequality? These types of questions are getting more frequent and pressing. And it's not just that business models are stretched and challenged, they are. But it's more that the worldviews that underpin our business models and funding models, which in turn drive our programs, services, fundraising approaches, boards, these are fundamentally challenged. And what's coming to light is that flourishing teams in the after-COVID era will be underpinned by a different set of worldviews. And as Jenna expressed so powerfully, many of our actions in the social impact world are shaped by worldviews that are colonial, white supremacist, paternalistic, and extractive. Whatever your organization's mission, now is the time to ask yourself, what worldviews underpin your organization's programs, services, fundraising, donor relationships, strategic plans, and governance? What worldviews is your organization perpetuating through its work? We're going to dive into all of this and more over the next couple of days. The old business models, the old strategic plans, the old donor and funder relationships, all of this is unraveling. We're living through a momentous shift in the story of social change. Day one of the summit is packed with incredible speakers who will share examples, provocations, insights, and inspiration. And for day two, we've partnered with Braindates again to elevate the way you meet new peers and learn from your peers. Braindates are hugely popular at our summits and events. So if you haven't created a profile, it takes 30 seconds. Do create a profile today and sign up for Braindates. Let me offer a huge thank you to the organizations who helped make this summit happen. United Way Centraide Canada, Community Foundations of Canada, the Muttart Foundation, Suncor, and E180. With that, I am super excited to introduce the inaugural Future of Good editorial fellow, Bronwyn Oatley, who will be hosting the summit. Bron has worked in diverse sectors and reported on all kinds of social change issues. And over the next many months, Bron will cover the incredible funding model changes, the business model adaptations that are emerging and underway across the nonprofit world and the philanthropic world. Welcome again, and I hope you find new inspirations, friends, and insights for your work. Bronwyn, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thanks so much, Vinod. I am Bronwyn Oatley, and I use they, them pronouns, and I'm really thrilled to be emceeing this summit. I'm thrilled because it gives me a chance to wear my favorite dinosaur shirt, which has been deep in my closet for most of the pandemic. But I'm also thrilled because it gives me a chance to share the stage with such an amazing group of powerful speakers, and to get to share space with all of you in an afternoon of learning. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm joining today from Toronto, which is the territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Ojibwe Chippewa, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And as we join together today, I'm just going to invite us all to like land a little bit in our strange digital space by taking a deep breath here to sort of acknowledge our presence in this shared space. So I'm going to do that also. Whew. Okay, so here we are on a Tuesday afternoon. What the heck have you signed up for? So there are 3 themes that we're going to be covering this afternoon. The first is origins, the second is relations, and the third is new futures. I'll tell you a little bit more about each of those as we go through the program today. The first chunk of our morning is going to, or our afternoon, excuse me, is going to be broken up into short talks given by each of our speakers. We're going to speak to each of them for like about 10 minutes, followed by a brief Q&A after each talk. After that, we're going to have a 10-minute break, and then you're going to have a chance to connect with a couple of other session participants in a brief breakout room. The sort of latter half of our session today is going to be a plenary discussion amongst all of our speakers. And that's a really awesome opportunity for you to have your pressing questions answered. So as we're going through the different sections of the day, please make sure to enter into the chat all of the questions that you have that you want our speakers to cover, either in this first chunk or later on this afternoon. One brief note that I wanted to share before we dive in, I'm going to invite us all, speakers and folks typing in the chat alike, to cut the jargon. There's a lot of jargon in the social impact world, and let's be welcoming of folks who are newer to this space by doing our absolute best to speak in plain language. If we're talking about the disbursement quota, maybe we can just say the amount that foundations have to give out each year, things like that. So I'm going to invite us all to do that. And without further ado, I am really thrilled to welcome up our first speaker. Nikki Sanchez is going to be speaking on the theme of origins. Origin talks are going to be exploring the dominant logics, worldviews, and systems, and ask questions around what history has been necessary to enable the creation of the philanthropic and nonprofit sectors. Nikki is a Pipple and Irish-Scottish academic, an Indigenous media maker, and an environmental educator. She holds a master's degree in Indigenous governance and is currently working on a PhD with a research focus in emerging visual media technology as it relates to Indigenous ontology. Pretty darn cool. Nikki, welcome. We're thrilled to have you.
Tlaskamadi, thank you for having me. I will just introduce myself. Piali Kwalikanatzik, Niatoka Nicola Halika Sanchez Hood, Nimai Papiol Den Kuskatlan, Nimitz Litz Tlaskamadi, Nihan Hiwan Tatlok. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm coming to you from the territories of the Secwepemc people, also known as Williams Lake. And I live as a guest on the territories, the unceded territories of the Lekwungen and Coast Salish people. I really want to just acknowledge how wonderful it is to be in this space with so many people who are coming together to learn and who are committed to the good work that they do. I have a small piece of pedagogy that I want to share with you today. It's a decolonial impact timeline. I'm going to just, before I go any further, Bronwyn, if you could just give me a thumbs up if my audio is coming through clear. Okay, fantastic. So very few Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians, have a deep understanding of their own history, or that the intergenerational wealth that they are beneficiaries of has been accumulated directly through land theft and genocide and abuse and murder of children. And so this decolonial impact timeline that I'm presenting today is just a small piece of a larger timeline that I use in the work that I do as a decolonial educator. And this specifically looks at the strategic and systemic policy and actions that our government, the Canadian government, has used since the inception of the nation to exclude, abuse, and exploit Indigenous people and their lands. This history has left us with a profound wealth and power inequity, to the extent that when we consider notions of philanthropy that engage Black and Indigenous people, we really in truth cannot think of it as philanthropy, but rather as necessary restitution. I do just want to give a trigger warning that for Indigenous people, for people impacted by intergenerational trauma of colonization and still living with the reality of the painful impacts of this process and its ongoing violence, these historic events can be quite difficult and traumatic to re-listen to. So I just want to give that kindness. And the points that I'm going to present are pretty thorough, and I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to get right to it. But I just do also want to say these are just a few that I thought were most relevant for today, whereas the complete timeline that I utilize when I'm doing decolonial education has over 50 points. And that is specifically just looking at economic strategies of disenfranchisement and erasure. Unfortunately, the colonial process in this country has utilized many, many other strategies as well. So this is just a taste. And we'll begin pre-nation state in 1531 at the origin of speculative capitalism as we know it now, in Antwerp, Belgium, and the first stock market there. And I think it's really important that people know that the very first speculative stocks that were traded were actually human bodies. Those stocks were slaves that were being kidnapped from their homelands and forced in the transatlantic slave trade to Turtle Island to be part of this colonial project. And so I really also want to just take this moment to acknowledge that when we talk about decolonization, we're always talking about Indigenous and Black people, because the fuel that colonization has run on are slavery and land theft and all the genocide that's included in that process. From here, we'll move to 1815, when the British government adopted a policy to civilize the Indian and encourage them to adopt European values. So this was initiated as an experiment in which Indian reserves are set up in isolated areas. Most people don't know that many reserves do not reflect the traditional land use and base areas of First Nations. So with the onset of this policy, First Nations were forced into these areas, and that was kind of the beginning of a long process of forced removals. Although having people on reserves made it easier for an assimilation process and the forcing of European religious and economic values to be imposed, true to market exclusion, whenever a community became successful at any economic endeavor, there was policy made to exclude them from ever being able to make a profit from those endeavors. In 1939, the Crown Lands Protection Act passed, which secured Crown control and ownership over all Indian lands. In 1815, Indian treaties began and granted limited land rights and financial compensation for the European acquisition of Indigenous territory. One act vested control of all Indian lands and property with the Commissioner of Indian Lands and stated that no sale of Indian lands could happen without Crown consent. This exempted Indians and resident spouses from taxes on reserve lands. A second act defines an Indian as all persons of Indian blood, the spouse of an Indian, anyone residing with Indians whose parents on either side were Indian, and anyone adopted in infancy by an Indian who resided on reserve. In 1862, the Pre-Exemption Act is created under James Douglas in British Columbia. This stipulated that anyone could stake a claim on land that was unoccupied and then register to own it. The act was the legal component of the systemic biological warfare used against coastal and interior First Nations in BC. This was done through the intentional exposure of coastal First Nations to the smallpox virus. Although at the time there were already vaccinations in existence, however, for the purposes of clearing land, vectors of infections were sent into First Nations villages and schools. 12 days after exposure, the police would be sent in to burn the villages, knowing that was the period of contraption, and people were now infectious. Because the First Nations on the coast exist in clan systems, they fled to their nearest villages. And that's how between 1862 and mid-1863, over 100,000 Indigenous people in BC were killed with the use of systemic biological warfare. This is why BC is unceded territory and no treaties were ever made here. There didn't need to be treaties. Smallpox cleared the land. In 1869, the Enfranchisement Act attempts to intensify the assimilation process. It includes Clause 6, which states that Indian women who marry non-Indian men will, along with their children, lose their status. Over the next 115 years, tens of thousands of Indigenous women and children lose their title, their right to land, and their ability to remain on their territories. In 1870, in the territory of BC, unilaterally denies existence of Aboriginal title to land. In 1884, the Indian Advancement Act gives power to the Indian agent to direct band council. This fundamentally dismantles traditional and hereditary governance structures. Other amendments include banning the potlatch and requiring Indians to have permits to leave their reserve. In 1886, compulsory residential school attendance for Native children is decreed. Over 150,000 children are forcibly taken from their homes. In some estimates, in these schools, the mortality rate teetered around 50%. Recently, reports have been made public that document not only the rampant sexual and physical abuse in these schools, but also that healthy children were intentionally exposed to infectious diseases. The Canadian government actually used children in these schools as young as 4 as test subjects for Health Canada studies on things like the impacts of starvation on the human body and the impacts of electric chairs. In the 1880s, the extermination of the buffalo occurs in an effort to remove Indigenous people from their lands and economic systems of sovereignty and force them to sign treaties. The Canadian government puts a price on buffalo head, resulting in the slaughter of 4 million buffalo and their near extinction. In 1889, Aboriginal fishers are excluded from commercial fishing until 1923. In 1927, Aboriginal people are prohibited from raising money or retaining a lawyer to pursue land claims. In 1850 to 1875, as part of a government plan to force Inuit to abandon their traditional camps and move into Western-style permanent communities, hundreds of Inuit sled dogs are shot by the RCMP and other settlement authorities. As compulsory residential school attendance winds down during the 1950s to the 1990s, a new strategy emerges to remove Indigenous children from their homes. The government-sanctioned kidnapping of Indigenous children continues through what's now known as the 60s Scoop, and at which time over 20,000 children are removed from their homes without cause and placed in majority non-Indigenous care. In 1960, for the first time in Canadian history, the right to vote is granted for First Nations. In 1996, Whitecalf Collegiate, the last residential school in Canada, closes. And unfortunately, just over the last couple months, there's been some very significant additions to this timeline. And I just want to take this moment to state that this history is not history, it is present. None of the forces of colonization that began at the onset of the nation creation for the Canadian state have ever ended. Their tactics have just changed form. And we see that very recently in 2021 when it was revealed that Indigenous children in foster care as young as 10 years old are forced to have IUDs inserted because of the rampant sexual abuse that children in the foster care system are exposed to. And most recently, and I hope all of you are already aware of this, but a mass grave of 215 bodies of children who died at residential school. It has been found at the Kamloops Residential School. Shortly after the uncovering of this mass grave, another 104 were found at the Brandon, Manitoba residential school, another 38 in Regina, Saskatchewan, and another 35 in Lestock, Saskatchewan. Sadly, this is just the beginning, as there were over 139 residential schools in Canada. And despite the fact that, as part of the 94 TRC recommendations being the uncovering of these graves, our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau continues to spend millions of dollars to fight and silence residential school survivors in court. And I think this is a really powerful and poignant conversation to be having today, because I truly believe that we are at a precipice in Canadian history, a huge time of truth telling and reckoning around our shared colonial history, a time for us to make choices about how we want to be as a nation going forward, and what justice looks like, and what equity could look like, and how we heal from this kind of a history. And before I close, I'll just say, when I was in undergrad, I had the fortune of listening to Honorable Justice Maurice Sinclair speak during his time as the Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what he said was that as human beings, it is so important for us to know where we come from, who we are, where we're going, and why we're here. And so those are questions I'm just going to pass forward to all of you today in relation to this history. You now know your history. You now know a little bit more about your history. So what does that mean for you about who you are, where you're going, and why you're here? Plas Kamati.
Thanks so much, Nikki, for that, challenging and essential history. In my own work, I've been doing a lot of research around the origins of philanthropy in Canada, and what you are sharing, the history of this country. It is absolutely true that the settler philanthropic sector would not exist without land theft, exploitation of labor, and exploitation of land. We simply do not get these massive pools of wealth without those things present. I want to ask just one question before we keep things moving along, and that is that there are many foundations and individual donors grappling with how to decolonize their giving. And I'm curious for your take. There have been calls for land back. There have been calls for reparations. From your lens, how can funders be thinking about working toward decolonizing in their giving?
I think even just the notion of giving, when we're in touch with the origins of our privilege and our location, and we see ourselves in relation to one another, it looks a lot different than charity, and it looks a lot different than giving. We need to think about what each of us have been given and where that wealth and that privilege has come from. And so, I mean, philanthropy is something that I'm very involved in, and do a lot of work with philanthropic organizations and helping them along that decolonial journey. And I think that ultimately our mission should really be around restitution of harms, and the creation of equity, meaningful equity, and meaningful justice, and the dynamic that is created when we look at it as a partnership to work towards collective healing, which ultimately benefits us all and profoundly benefits our earth, which in turn benefits the future and our future ancestors. That dynamic is one that becomes much more equitable and that of a true partnership versus that of forced dependency. And so I think that we really need to begin by reframing that, and also really asking ourselves the core of our motivation. Are we truly willing to redistribute our power, our wealth, so that perhaps there isn't a need for philanthropy, and instead we can see partnership, instead we can see mutual innovation, instead we can see mutual empowerment. and encouragement.
Great, thanks. Yeah, what you're saying there makes me think of a workshop I once did focus on fundraising. And one of the reasons I said I hated fundraising is because I felt like a person on my knees with my arms up asking for money. And the reframing that I was taught was sort of actually, no, this is a hand across, asking for a partnership. This is not a hand up. And similarly, I think shifting from this idea of the philanthropist on high, you know, extending arms down is absolutely necessary. So thank you so much for getting us started in such a good way. We're going to move to our second speaker, Paulette Senior, the president and CEO of the Canadian Women's Foundation. Paulette is going to speak to our second theme, which is relations. This is exploring the relations between funder and fundee, and what relations are required to center reciprocity and justice. Paulette has seen both sides of this coin. She started her career on the front lines of social service organizations in Toronto neighborhoods. And for the last several years, she's been leading organizations that support that same change. So welcome, Paulette.
Thank you, Bron. Great to see you. Great to see everyone. And I was just sitting here thinking as I held on to every word that Nikki said in her brilliant presentation. I was wondering if I could just give her my time, because I'd love to listen to her for another hour. But that is not what we have planned today. So let me just move forward. So hello, everyone. Thank you to Future of Good and everyone who has organized this discussion and summit. And to Nikki for the background and where we are today, but also where we've come from such that we are where we are today. I am joining you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, First Nation, and Williams Treaty, signatories of the Mississauga and Chippewa Nations, also known as Pickering, Ontario. I am happy to be part of this emerging, urgent, and critical conversation. The nonprofit sector, as well as the foundation and philanthropic sector, may call on other institutions and sectors to confront issues like anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism and colonialism, or at least aim to address the outcomes of these systemic issues. But I believe we have to look inward as well as organizations. Foundations and philanthropic institutions are colonial entities. Our practices can be rooted in entrenched and harmful systems, and we must indeed acknowledge the power dynamics inherent in philanthropy, and continually question how we are making funding decisions. Before the pandemic, the entire staff at my organization, the Canadian Women's Foundation, with our board members, embarked on a collective learning journey to reflect on learnings in the book, Decolonizing Wealth, Indigenous Wisdom to Heal Divides and Restore Balance. Though it's based on the author's own experience of working as a philanthropy executive in the US, his observations are critical and relevant to the work we do here in Canada. Edgar Villanova, who identifies as Native American, points out in the book how white supremacy has been used to justify brutal colonial exploits. Colonizers amassed land and wealth on the backs of those they colonized and marginalized: Indigenous people, Black people, racialized people. Charities were created to do good in the marginalization gap without much design to challenge the root causes of the very problems they're trying to do good with. Many foundations were launched using amassed fortunes in this particular context, and after generations of marginalization, those same marginalized communities must then apply for access to that philanthropic wealth in the form of loans or grants. That's the reality. This insight rings uncomfortably true in the world of philanthropy. The Canadian Women's Foundation has a bit of a different origin story in Canada compared to most other foundations. We were founded 30 years ago, 1991, by a group of fierce feminists who saw that there was no foundation geared toward gender equity work with a feminist intersectional lens. At the time, it was estimated that just about 2% of charitable donations from corporations and foundations and individuals were going to gender equality efforts. The foundation was not launched on an endowment. The funds we've operated on and invested in communities have been largely given by individual and corporate donors or government bodies toward our mandate. While this separates us a bit in terms of our humble beginnings, 30 years later, we know we are no less part of a system that makes us equally culpable, and that collectively we must acknowledge the truth of our sector, the one that we work in, while working to transform how we go about our work. With all that in mind, it has been important for us to take a critical look at our work as a granting body based on fundraising and as a gender justice thought leader in the sector throughout the country. And as we confront our roles within colonial and racist legacies, how do we as nonprofits, philanthropic organizations and charities work to make meaningful, deep systemic change? I'm going to share 3 strategies based on how we're approaching this at the foundation. But this is in no way complete because we are indeed on a journey. The first is a commitment to ongoing learning, listening, and reevaluating our work. For us, this has meant professional development in learning and unlearning about decolonization, as well as anti-oppressive and anti-racist approaches. It means hiring people with expertise in intersection, with a commitment in intersectional feminist practice and evaluating performance on those principles related to gender justice. It means evaluation processes to ensure we are investing increasingly in communities who have been blocked from accessing wealth. It also means evaluation to ensure we better serve the people, the organizations we grant to and their communities. So we look to them for input and advice on things like streamlining application processes, enhance our outreach approaches to better reach underserved communities, continuously removing identified barriers to make granting processes more inclusive and intersectional. These shifts have made a big difference in our work, and now over our 30% of our grants go to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit programs by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. It has also meant we were able to launch an emergency fundraising strategy weeks after the pandemic hit and move over $33 million to date to gender justice organizations who struggle to meet elevated needs. And of course, there's a lot more we need to do as we listen, learn, and unlearn. The second approach is committing to equitable and feminist funding principles. So as we pursue long-term goals, including decolonization and reconciliation, it's important that they're inextricably linked to our strategic and annual planning with measurable performance outcomes. For the foundation, this has meant ensuring that the truth and reconciliation process is part of our strategic plan and work. It has meant co-creating principles of feminist funding that match and signing on to the Philanthropic Communities Declaration of Action developed by the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada to take action accordingly. These have given us criteria and benchmarks for us to pursue. And as we seek to support systemically marginalized communities, we are conscious of not entering into relationships with the traditional damaging savior mentality or patriarchal approach. We have a strategy to in place to fund programs in the North, which is working to strengthen community relationships and a better understanding of the uniqueness of the region. In partnership with Make Way Foundation, for example, we have been honored to support the launch of a Northern Women and Girls Advisory Committee with reps from the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, Nunavik, and Nunatsiavut. This dynamic committee provides leadership in Northern grant making and has helped us to open doors for the foundation to support some excellent community-led initiatives. This work is connected to the ideal set out in our feminist funding principles, where we recognize the need to reduce the power imbalances inherent in funder-fundee relationships. We use participatory decision-making processes so that women and communities most affected by our work have their say in what happens. The goal is to build relationships with grantees based on trust that we're all bringing our best efforts to solve social problems. The third approach I'll talk about is advocating at the federal level to reduce barriers to secure sustainable funding. Aside from grant making, the foundation works to propel systemic change on Canada's funding practices. We're advocating for changes to regulations that govern granting processes for foundations and philanthropic organizations. There are federal regulations that disqualify grassroots initiatives, critical grassroots initiatives that are doing incredible, fantastic work in their communities. This is a policy shift that needs to happen, and I would say now, especially when it comes to Indigenous, Black, and racialized-led initiatives. I know that another speaker will be addressing these issues later in the summer, but I don't want to steal that thunder, so I won't get more into that. But it's great to have this opportunity to recognize common barriers that we're all trying to eliminate as nonprofits and raise our voices together against them. I'll wrap up here now and hope this gives you a sense of different approaches we can all be taking on this journey toward transforming funding models. And thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paulette. So many good examples in there of, positively messing with the power relations in the philanthropic sector. So thank you so much for that. Our next speaker on the topic of relations is Kosi Sachukwu Nebe. She is a Nigerian-Canadian visual artist and curator. She's an economist by training and a policy analyst by profession. And her art practice explores the process of racialization and aims to engage viewers on issues, both personal and structural, in ways that bring awareness to their own complicity. Yeah, no small task there. Welcome.
Sorry, I'll unmute myself. Thank you so much, Ronan. And I will be sharing my screen, so give me 1 second while I try and put that together. I have to go back to the front. Sorry about this. So hi, everyone. I'm really excited and honored to be here with you all today. As Ronan mentioned, I am an artist, a curator, and a policy analyst, but today I'll be speaking primarily based on my experience as a curator, and specifically my experience curating an exhibition in 2020 called They Forgot That We Were Seeds, which brought together 8 Black and Indigenous women artists at the Carleton University Art Gallery. And I'll be using that experience to kind of bring up some lessons learned that I think have some relevance to do with policy and the work that you do in the nonprofit sector. So I'll jump right into it. So this is where my story begins. The photos here were taken from my time doing Indigenous engagement for the federal government, which brought me to communities across the country, from Thunder Bay to Yellowknife to Nain Nunatsiavut, which is where these particular photos were taken. It was this movement across geography, but also across community lines, that made me realize the importance of acknowledging my positionality, the first lesson. When I first took on the position of Indigenous engagement lead, I never questioned my intentions to help and contribute to the development of a policy that did good and hopefully helped rectify previous harms done by the government. In fact, I thought that doing this work showed that I was a good ally. The truth is that when I was actually met with a lot of mistrust when I went into communities, because despite my identity as a young Black woman, I was seen primarily as a representative of the federal government, which I was. For the first time, I was truly forced to reckon with what it means to be on this land and the manners in which I was complicit in a settler colonial project. What I learned from this experience is the importance of acknowledging the ways in which we may be causing harm by not questioning our good intentions and assumptions of being benefactors. For me, this took the form of questioning the ease with which I called myself an ally to Indigenous peoples without ever questioning the kinds of relationships, including personal, that I had actually developed. But it also means calling into question the anti-Black racism within some other racialized communities, including within the Indigenous community. It means questioning why we're so quick to fund non-Black led community organizations that serve Black Canadians, while Black led organizations receive 0.03% of funds. It means thinking about lateral violence within a community and how our actions may have unexpected consequences in areas of gender equality, for example. It means always questioning, starting from your own positionality. The second lesson is to allow ourselves to imagine otherwise. Between growing up in Gatineau, doing an undergrad in economics at McGill, and joining the public service as a policy analyst, all I've known are Eurocentric ways of knowing that are geared towards extraction, categorization, classification, and separation. When it comes to redefining my ways of relating not only to Indigenous peoples, but also to myself and to my work, I knew that I couldn't do that within the confines of my position in government. So what I turned to instead was my art making practice, stepping into the role of curator for the first time to curate They Forgot That We Were Seeds. And at each and every turn of me curating this exhibition, there was an opportunity for the institution I was working with, the Carleton University Art Gallery, to say no. To say no to me having a Black woman farmer as one of the artists, growing plants within the gallery as a way of turning to nature to identify different patterns of relationality that are possible between Black and Indigenous peoples. They had an opportunity to say no to me as a curator, a first-time curator wanting to take on such an ambitious project that brought together 8 different artists from across the country. But instead, they supported me throughout the process. They welcomed and accepted my proposal and worked with me to actually submit a grant application to the Ontario Arts Council. And every time that we came across an obstacle, they supported me and helped me find ways to overcome that obstacle. They gave me a space to imagine otherwise ways of relating with Indigenous women at a time that I desperately needed it. And speaking here as a Black woman, a racialized woman, I think this is something that we're oftentimes not offered. We're not offered the space or the funding to take a risk. We're not offered the space and the time and the support to experiment, to find otherwise ways of relating with one another, of supporting our communities and of building our communities up. Instead, we're oftentimes forced into a status quo of what we think or others think will work, even though we know deep down that it's not appropriate or it's not the right approach. So even though the kind of lesson here was, allowing ourselves to imagine otherwise, it's actually a bit of a wrong title in the sense that it's not that we don't allow ourselves to imagine otherwise, it's that we're prevented from doing so due to a number of different kinds of funding, restrictions, and so on. The third lesson is control, or rather learning how to cede control and make room for something better, even if it means stepping aside. This photo was taken at a private dinner of Black and Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people that acted as the first piece of public programming for the exhibition. In organizing the gathering, I knew that I didn't want to be the one facilitating this event for fear that I would replicate the same systems of knowledge extraction that often take place in engagement and consultation processes. For this reason, I asked the Carleton University Art Gallery to hire 2 independent co-facilitators, Muna Mohammed, a Black woman, and Cole Poplinski, a Two-Spirit Algonquin and Métis individual, to design the session. They advised against using the gathering as a moment to talk about shared traumas and instead recommended a gathering focused on merely sharing space with one another. The end result was a sharing of emotions and feelings in a way that I have never experienced before. It was raw and truthful and just a space of healing for each and every participant in the dinner. So by questioning my positionality, challenging my assumptions, and stepping aside, we were able to create a space that felt safe, intimate, and sacred for all participants. And it was only made possible by me ceding control. The fourth lesson is care. From the genesis of the project to the way in which the exhibition was curated, care was the foundational element. Care work is the social reproductive work that keeps our households and our communities going. It is the cooking, the emotional labor, the gathering, the storytelling, and the education. It is a time shared with no other purpose but to ensure the well-being of the other. The dinner was something I knew I wanted to organize as soon as I had conceived of the exhibition. It was an opportunity for me to revisit my experience engaging with Indigenous folks and to replace the feelings of mistrust because of my role in government with something different. What I realize now is that these are the kind of spaces that we should be funding, spaces that are designed by us, for us, with no other goal than for us to come together. How can we redefine our indicators for success such that they capture the beauty and radical nature of moments such as these? Recognizing that such spaces can only be created when we seek control and challenge our worldviews and assumptions. How can we invest in our own self-transformation? The final lesson that I'd like to end on is mutuality, which is defined as the sharing of feelings, action, or relationship between two or more parties. And at this particular moment, I have to admit that I prefer this term to the concept of solidarity, which is defined as a unity or agreement of feeling or action, especially among individuals with a common interest. So the key difference here is the notion of common interest, which to me speaks to the need for an underlying objective or goal when engaging or relating with another person. This begs the question of what happens when there's no common interest or goal, or when our goals are at odds. Do these feelings of unity then disappear? Mutuality asks that we develop, share, and honor these feelings at all times. It is the foundation rather than the end outcome. In my work in government now, I'm trying to hold on to these lessons as best as possible. I'm trying to develop relationships with stakeholders rooted in trust that demonstrates the genuine care for one another. I take GBA Plus very seriously, and I think critically about how our initiatives are likely to impact different groups of people. I engage wholeheartedly with those who reach out to me, and I reach out to those who never felt heard by government. This, I believe, is the beauty of being a public servant, a shared feeling and relationship between the people I am here to serve and myself. So I'll just stop there.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much, Cozy Sojiku. That was, really great. I think like so many important lessons in there, so many like nuggets around good funder practices. I heard like a positive, supportive funder relationship, sort of supporting you to do what you wanted to do, even if they didn't necessarily understand exactly what it was. Also some really positive community practices that you were engaged in, ceding power when it wasn't sort of the right thing for you to be holding in particular roles, mutuality between Black and Indigenous people for mutual learning and mutual action. So yeah, so many beautiful things in there. How different our world would be if there was more of that in there. Our next speaker is going to be Jonas Hassan. Jonas is speaking on our third theme, which is New Futures. This is a theme that explores the models and approaches that can support social change organizations to be more resilient in the future. Jonas is the CEO of Justice Fund, a recently launched nonprofit. That is what we're talking about, right on. And Justice Fund works to support communities in Toronto who are impacted by conflict with the law. And one of the ways that they're doing it powerfully is by pushing for philanthropic reform. So for more on that, here is Jonas.
Thank you, Bronwyn. We're very excited to participate in today's discussion. And like Bronwyn said, I'm the CEO of Justice Fund Toronto, which was recently launched by myself, my colleagues Jermaine Creed and Noah Faoury-Shabib, the co-founder of OVO. And for the purpose of this conversation, I want to focus on our second pillar to reform philanthropy, from settler philanthropy. For the record-breaking violence that the city of Toronto is suffering from, I only hold two groups responsible. Our governments that are supposed to provide our communities with the ability to live in safety and dignity, and this Canadian philanthropic industry with over $85 billion in taxpayer assets. If The justification of the existence of these philanthropic industries is that they're supposed to fill the gaps that government have, or to fund innovation, or to fund risk. I would argue that we haven't seen that in a sufficient enough manner. How can this sector justify $85 billion in assets, taxpayer money that is not being used to build a healthy and thriving Canada? Since the last financial recession in 2008, foundations in Canada have doubled their total assets to $85 billion. We live in a city of Toronto that is socially, politically, and economically segregated. It is unacceptable that the fourth largest city in North America, the second largest financial hub in North America, is also the child poverty capital of Canada, a city in which 84% of Indigenous families with children live in poverty, where 1/3 of racialized children live in low-income households, where we have neighborhoods up to 45% in child poverty rates. Often, those same neighborhoods are the neighborhoods that are socially, politically, and economically segregated. With over $85 billion in assets, you would assume collectively Canada's philanthropic industries would step up, but they haven't. Indigenous groups across this country are getting about $1 for every 175 given to non-Indigenous groups. The fact that the Mormon Church in Utah receives 1.5 more in funding from Canadian foundations than all of the Indigenous groups in Canada demonstrates this philanthropic industry's seriousness. Over the past few months, we've seen an increased focus on trust-based philanthropy as a theme that some foundations have utilized to demonstrate their growth or shift in funding approach. The principles of trust-based philanthropy should be the basis of all philanthropic industries grant making. That means implementing multi-year agreements, simplifying the application process and reporting process, to name a few. Implementing trust-based philanthropy is the bare minimum. Although I don't believe in the philanthropic sector's ability to self-regulate or reform, this sector is not speaking the same language as the communities they serve, nor is it reflective of our communities. So why should I expect any better? We've asked for unrestricted funding, large investments, and in return, the sector has given us social bonds, results-based funding, and participatory grant making with microgrants. As such, we are calling for the federal government of Canada to step up and make the following reforms. Starting with increasing the disbursement quota, the minimum percentage of assets foundations must pay out from its 3.5%, which is one of the lowest in the world, to immediately shifting that to 10%. I'd also encourage you not to be distracted by these narratives of needing more time to collect data or to come up with evidence-based solutions. Indigenous and Black communities know that historically these same narratives were used to marginalize and delay investments in our communities in the first place. We are also not distracted by the claim of those who claim to represent the sector but are not actually reflective of our communities. Second, we need to lift the restrictions on partnerships that currently exist in the Income Tax Act of Canada. There's a proposed bill making its way through the Senate right now, and even though that bill has significant gaps and can possibly open Pandora's box by creating a wild, wild west in philanthropy similar to the United States, I believe that this two-approach system of those who are qualified and unqualified is going to significantly delay our ability to recover from this pandemic. Third, we require all Canadian foundations to redirect their assets towards 100% impact-based investments by 2030. It's unacceptable that charitable assets can be used to further the urban affordability crisis through investments in real estate investment trusts, or further exacerbate the climate crisis we're in through the resource extraction sector. By requiring these assets to be 100% impact invested, we can support creating new affordable housing, community infrastructure, and renewable energy. And even though we might make this change, I don't believe in the social financing community of Canada. They are not reflective of our communities, nor do they invest in our communities. And when they do, it's only through philanthropic intermediaries. The folks at New Power Labs have done a pretty good job of demonstrating the power imbalance between impact investing, and I encourage you guys to check them out. Fourth, Government of Canada should introduce mandatory spend down requirements for all registered foundations and require existing foundations to establish how they will spend these assets down within a 30-year timeline. From a public policy standpoint, Canadian taxpayers are not getting a fair return on these benefits that large philanthropists and foundations receive. The notion that holding these assets in perpetuity by the philanthropic industries is helping our ability to sustain our work is absolute bullshit. We are about to witness the greatest wealth transfer in Canadian history, and most of that funds is going to go to Gen X and millennials. How much growth is acceptable for this philanthropic sector? We're currently at 85 billion. 5 years from now, we might be at 100. 5 years from then, we might be at 120. How much is too much for this sector? Fifth, government should require a disbursement quota for all donor advised funds. How can we ensure that these assets are not used to become charitable parking lots? Can individual community foundations across this country live up to the values that they hold very dearly and demonstrate that they're actually all in? Will they make the principles of trust-based philanthropy as part of their bylaws? Will they add disbursement quotas on individual donor advised funds? Will they increase the transparency and accessibility of these funds? Will they name the fund holder, the total assets, and where these assets go? Probably not. The most frustrating thing I hear from community foundations across this country is that they don't tell their donors where to put their assets. What? Legally, the moment those funds hit the institution's account, these assets become the fiduciary responsibility of that individual community foundation. If making these changes require adapting legal agreements or going all the way up to the Ontario Supreme Court, then go for it. We're not interested in performative allyship. We need community foundations across this country to be accomplices for the communities that they serve and not their fund holders. And lastly, we need the federal government of Canada to create incentives to direct more funds to Black-led, Black-mandated, Black-serving, and/or Indigenous-led philanthropic foundations. The federal government of Canada already has an endowment incentives program under the Canadian Cultural Investment Fund. Are these funds only acceptable for white-led, white-serving art institutions? However, these recommendations are only philanthropic reform are just a starting point for the conversation of a fundamental reform of the charitable sector, led by the frontline workers and community organizations and not a handful of influential sector leaders. Who in this sector will demonstrate transformational leadership to use these assets to wholeheartedly implement reconciliation on Indigenous communities' terms, truly build a better Canada and live up to our international responsibilities? I don't believe in the sector's ability to step up to that. So it's incumbent upon the federal government of Canada to ensure that these assets are used to serve a charitable purpose. Although this moment of Canadian philanthropic consciousness is rapidly approaching grand closing, the urgency in our communities has not dissipated. The number of Toronto shootings have risen 176% between 2017 and 2019. Last year, a 12-year-old was shot to this violence. This past week, an 11-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 1-year-old were shot. As a recently liberated and recovering fundraiser, I know that this sector does not consider our communities worthy of major gifts, let alone transformational gifts. Those are only reserved for failing educational institutions and hospitals, whose funding should be the responsibility of our governments in the first place. We now have a moment to display transformational leadership in this country as we battle and recover from COVID. We have a federal, provincial, municipal election coming up all within the next year. The restrictions on non-for-profit sector's ability to conduct advocacy was removed in 2019. How will we in this sector of 86,000 charities, 55,000 which are in the province of Ontario alone, that employ over 10% of Canada's working GDP, and in the city of Toronto alone contribute $14 billion of annual revenue, how will we get loud and speak up? Will the non-for-profit sector allow these power imbalances to continue? Will we allow ourselves to be governed by our charitable sector laws that are rooted in racism, colonialism, exploitation, extraction, and the genocide of Indigenous peoples? I believe there's a lot more of us in the sector that want to see this type of change. I believe there's a lot more of us in a few stubborn private foundations that see these assets as their own and not taxpayer money. But I do understand that, some might be afraid to bite the hand that feeds them. In that case, that's why our organization is here. Thank you very much. I'll pass it back to you, Bronwyn.
Thanks so much, Jonas. Yeah, really, really great, clear set of proposals. And thanks also for bringing, the weight that so many communities across the country are experiencing of the challenges they're facing. Yeah, in the plenary later on this afternoon, we're going to have some more space to talk about yours and other perspectives about how folks across the sector, not just the leaders of foundations, can engage in this sort of advocacy work. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that a little bit later. Our next speaker of the first part of our day here is Gina Lucarelli. Gina is the team leader of the UN Development Programme's Accelerator Labs program. The aim of that program is to accelerate learning to support member nations to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Gina brings over 20 years experience in human rights and development work. Welcome, Gina.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn, and thank you to the Future of Good. I'm really so honored to be here. I was already, and then now seeing this beginning, I'm really humbled. I guess what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of a zoom out to a global development story. So this is not a conversation about the accountability mechanisms and financial instruments that are necessary in Canada. I work with a team to steward a network of 91 social innovation labs, which we've embedded inside the United Nations Development Program. The fact that we've done this is kind of, it's a story of, good things are possible, I suppose. We've had really brave funders from the Qatar Fund for Development and the Federal Republic of Germany who gave us some space to fail within. They told us it's okay if not all the labs are standing after the 3 years of their funding. And now we're in a situation where we have teams embedded in the United Nations who are doing three main things. They are exploring weak signals of change, looking at possible and probable and preferable futures. They're exploring new data sources like satellite data and mobile phone data and social media data, even radio data in Togo. That's a favorite project of mine. They're also using ethnographic methods and others to learn from the people that we serve, to really surface their knowledge, their inventions, their practices, their innovations, and learn from them. And then finally, they put together these kind of portfolios of experiments to learn what works and what doesn't in sustainable development. So what I wanted to do is kind of offer you three questions to think about based on our experience with the UNDP Accelerator Lab Network. These are three questions I think underpin funding models. They connect funders and grantees. And so hopefully by exploring them, we can find kind of the root causes of where transformation is needed. So the first question is, what is evidence? Evidence is clearly something important to funders and grantees. What is learning is my second question for you, and what is success is the third question. When we talk about what is evidence, when we started this network of 91 labs, which is admittedly a bonkers number of labs, we didn't just want to be a franchise of labs. We wanted to create a learning network. And in fact, our PR people were very talented, and they suggested that we would be creating the world's largest and fastest learning network on sustainable development. So here we are trying to kind of live up to that promise. What we realized is, look, in a moment of planetary crisis like the one we are in, there really aren't best practices that can just be copy pasted into different contexts and, poof, we have a successful evidence-based policy and program. This is just not possible. So what we've been doing is in each of these 91 labs, we have one person whose full-time job it is, I'm still amazed that we were able to pull this off, but we have one person whose full-time job it is to surface innovations of women and men dealing with the impact of climate change on their crops, trying to social distance in difficult circumstances, just basically what do they know? And in the course of this, we've kind of encountered a little bit of a battle of the epistemologies in the sense that we're creating evidence, ethnographic evidence, which is a bit not the form that our organization is used to. It doesn't come in charts and graphs, and it doesn't make predictions. But we are starting to see an acknowledgement that some of the policy failures are actually due to this massive distance that we have from the people we serve. It's not to say everything is rosy. We still get some resistance where they say, you promised us innovation and you're bringing us, low tech cassava peelers and solar cookers and, bricks made out of recycled plastic. But we are trying to change that definition of what evidence is. Of course, the question of evidence becomes even more complex in a kind of post-truth age, where misinformation travels 7 times as fast as real information, according to an MIT study a few years ago. So we're kind of asking, what actually is this connection between evidence and impact? So the second question I have for you is about learning. What is learning? We all want to advance based on the programs that we deliver. So we're a network of labs, and we're trying to go forward to become a learning network. In doing that, we're running into some challenges. Many of you in education fields will know that all learning happens in context, and therefore extracting the heuristic that applies in a transnational basis is really, really difficult. Most learning, the best learning, is actually inside people's heads, and they always know more than they can tell. Very few people read. We all have information overload. And our network of labs is incredibly decentralized. So the labs work on what they want to work on and largely how they want to work on it, and it changes all the time. So we're trying to use a little bit of data science to tap into what's happening there, to map some patterns, and to start to see, okay, we're starting to have a lot of labs work on the tourism sector because it got so hit because of COVID. What does that mean? We're looking at, having India help Namibia because Namibia is now on a 3rd wave of COVID, and looking for homegrown oxygen production methods. So these are the kinds of things that we're trying to put together in learning. So we take this very decentralized mass of reflections and learning and try and find those patterns from it. And finally, what is success? So if we think about wicked problems, right? It's Rittel and Weber who put this out, right? Deforestation is a wicked problem. Averting climate disaster is a wicked problem. They're the kinds of problems that have multiple stakeholders whose agendas are conflicting. It takes a very long time to evaluate solutions. Each solution has many knock-on effects, and it kind of ramifies throughout the system. And fundamentally, wicked problems are never completely solved. So when you want to be accountable for your stewardship of public funds, you have to ask, what exactly did we get for that money? And sometimes we find ourselves saying, well, we know a lot more about the problem, which may or may not be satisfying. And we also end up saying, well, we created demand for a new way of working. But I want to put to you that we should explore kind of different forms of accountability for public funding. Traditional logical frameworks tend to plot out this linear pathway where you say, I will take this action, this result will happen, and then that outcome will occur in the world. And actually what we find is that it's much messier. It's much more radial, right? I could take this action. These 3 things could happen. 2 of them might be positive. 1 of them might be completely unintended and unfavorable. So if we can start to think more in terms of radial logical frameworks, rather than forcing ourselves to predict ex ante exactly what the impact of our work would be, that would be a step forward. For us at the labs, we try to kind of define success in a way that we can assess as we go forward. Key for us is diversifying how we understand problems and solutions. So just, if you're working on deforestation, if you get the illegal charcoal brick dealer from Uganda in the room with the Ministry of Forest, with the Forestry Ministry, we're starting to see the system, to see the complete system. We're also trying to hope that some of the experiments and explorations and all this fun innovation stuff we do influences somebody to take a decision somewhere in some way. That's a hard one to measure, but it's something we definitely keep our eye on. And finally, while we're trying to change our own organization of the UN Development Program, we're also trying to embed and spread practices of experimentation, exploration, and learning from grassroots innovations in our government partners and others in country. So thank you for the opportunity. These are my 3 questions for you. What is evidence, what is success, and what is learning? And hopefully we can explore these throughout the discussions.
Thank you so much, Gina. Yeah, powerful and important question.
Bronwyn, are you on mute? There's no sound.
Hello?
Oh, yeah, you're good now.
Okay, sorry about that. Thanks so much, Gina. That was really great. And yeah, look forward to the opportunity to bring in some of those questions into our plenary discussion a little bit later. We have now reached that blissful point in our programming where we get a 10-minute break. I don't know about you, but I need to use the washroom. So we're going to take 10 minutes. Please come back at 2:32 promptly, at which time we're going to move into brief breakout rooms for you to discuss some of what you've been hearing. So it's important to be back pretty close to right on time so that you can be in your groups right away. Enjoy your 10 minutes. See you soon.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some quick peer-to-peer time reflecting and sharing and meeting some change makers. Before we move on to our panel with all of the speakers, which I know I'm looking forward to and cannot wait for, I'd like to invite Dan Clement, CEO of United Way Canada, and Andrew Trinalal, CEO of Community Foundations of Canada, to join us. They are lead partners for the summit and for the Future of Good editorial fellowship on transforming funding models. Dan and Andrew, are you with us?
I'm here.
Yep. I'm here, Vinod.
Okay, super. We'll just give it a second for you to be on the screen here. Terrific. Dan and Andrew, welcome.
Thanks for having us
here.
What an energizing summit so far. This might be a difficult question to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What is one significant insight or perspective for you so far today?
I'll
go ahead, Dan.
Yeah.
First insight, really glad we're supporting this because it was a great conversation. That was my first one, and Future of Good team has done a great job bringing really dynamic voices. And the second thing, I guess, if I can have the second, is this throughout. All the speakers were amazing, but I kept hearing relationships as a theme, the sort of that went through it.
Right.
You know, having a relationship with our history, right? A relationship with our own ambitions and aspirations and mental models as a funder or an actor in philanthropy. And then a recognition that we're having relationships with all sorts of diverse communities that have a very different perception and understanding of that history and aspirations and hopes. Relationships come with power. We got to acknowledge it and name it. And what we really, really want is relationships that are based on trust, right? And trust means you can have partnerships. And, you know, that means you're in a relationship that's not going to be perfect. That's not going to be linear. That's going to be dynamic. So, you know, the speakers were amazing, but I just kept hearing that little nugget throughout.
Right. Andrew, what about you?
Yeah, thanks, Vinod. I have to recognize that you just put on a great group of speakers, you know, Jenna, Paulette, Nikki, Nebe, Jonas, Gina, like just top-notch insight. And I think the thing that I heard is the intersection of two concepts that we talk about often, and that is belonging and transformation. And, you know, Brene Brown is somebody that I follow, and she talks about belonging as being accepted for who you are. And we often conflate fitting in with belonging, and fitting in is being accepted for being like everyone else. And I think we have to acknowledge that philanthropy has been a world leader in causing people to fit into the business models, fit into the funding practices, fitting into the culture. And that may have worked 40 or 50 years ago in Canada, but I see that with the leaders that you have in this group and at this summit, there isn't any fitting in anymore. It's like that philanthropy, you need to accept us for who we are, and we have a different point of view. You know, the other side of this is transformation, and that's another term that's often ambiguous, but transformation is a psychological thing. It's about interchange. And what I heard was, hey, donor primacy, asset accumulation, extractive practices, restricted funds, all of those are social constructs. They're created by people. They're not the law. Nobody forces us to accumulate capital. Nobody forces us to put donors' interests above community. Those are psychological things that are embedded in our culture, particularly in philanthropy. And we can change those things. In fact, that's what I heard all the speakers say. We can change those things. The fascinating thing is this. I looked at the participants, and you had close to 300 participants. I recognize some leaders of large funding organizations, but not many. And that's a problem. We need CEOs of large funders, whether they're community foundations or private foundations, to be in these meetings, but they're not there. I don't know why. I know that you publicize widely. I know that you have a great network in Future of Good, but they're not showing up. And that's also telling. It's very telling. And I think we have to come to grips with the fact, and Jonas said this well, that community institutions are detached from their communities because the communities have changed and they have not.
Right. Super. Dan and Andrew, thank you so much for joining us, for supporting both the fellowship and the summit. And I hope you have an exciting rest of the day. Ron, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you. So next we're going to dive into the plenary discussion portion, but before we do, I just want to welcome one additional panelist, Rodney Foxworth. Rodney is the founder of Invested Impact, a nonprofit consulting firm and intermediary that connects philanthropic actors and impact investment capital and channels it to underrepresented social entrepreneurs. Rodney brings a couple of decades of experience working for and with funders, with nonprofits and with grassroots groups alike to push for justice-aligned philanthropy. So we are really lucky to have him joining as a speaker in a second, but also in our plenary panel. So welcome, Rodney. Thanks so much for joining us. And I'm going to just dive right into our first question. I'm going to take us back to our origins theme a little bit and pose up again that question I posed to Nikki at the outset. I'd love to hear a couple of your perspectives on how funders and philanthropic institutions can engage in the work of decolonization. So some foundations might be thinking about, okay, should I be trying to track the path of the accumulation of the wealth that I hold and then be returning that wealth to the communities who were impacted by it? Is that how I decolonize? Some might be thinking, do I try and engage more Indigenous people to be on my staff or on my board? Some might be thinking, should I literally give land back? If my foundation owns land or capital assets, should I just be giving that back? So I'd love to hear some of your perspectives on how funders engage in the work of decolonizing. Rodney, you're new to our squad here. Do you want to jump in first?
Absolutely, happy to. And really looking forward to this conversation. I think the way that the question was posed, it's a wonderful question. And I think one of the things that funders need to really wrestle with is that there's a multitude of pathways in which they can engage more authentically. And one that has to be looking at their own individual and institutional role in colonization, which is consistent and perpetual. The other thing I think about, and I believe this to be a global pattern, and I know this to be true in the US, is that you raise that question of who do you bring in? What perspectives do you bring in? The reality of it is, again, I believe this to be global, but I can speak to it specifically in the US, is that the majority of decision makers are white and male. And that really creates an environment in which there's a concentration of power that has not been disrupted. And so I think one question that I always think about is, yes, it's important to bring in new voices, but typically what happens is the institution is not prepared to actually be a place that is enabling of and supportive to those voices. And so it's not simply about bringing in faces, but it's actually about shifting the entire institution itself and ceding power and perspective and influence to individuals that actually have lived experience, that have really intentional and emotional connection to the issues that have experienced them themselves, right? This is one of the things that I think about so often, given my work at Common Future. Our organization is predominantly people of color. I myself, I grew up in, as a Black male in West Baltimore in the States, and have a set of experiences that really inform my day-to-day leadership of the organization. And when I look around, there are very few individuals that have sort of the biography, the set of experiences that I have, and even and not even the fact that, and oftentimes that set of perspectives is not qualified as like an asset, right? So we actually have to interrogate, like, that is actually a skill set, and it's actually an asset that we need to be able to not just bring into institutions, but leverage those experiences to transform those institutions.
Totally. Thanks, Rodney. Who else wants to jump in on this one?
I can jump in.
Please.
So right now I'm actually on leave, education leave, so I'm doing a master's at LSE, and I've been learning a lot about decolonization, decoloniality, and so on. And there's an article that I read that I always come back to when I think about and talk about decolonization, which is called "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor." And I think it's oftentimes important to go back to that, because fundamentally decolonization is about land. And I think that when we're talking about it and we're not talking about it as a metaphor for other issues, then fundamentally it's about repatriating land back to Indigenous communities. And the way in which that takes shape, or what that looks like, might not be what we expect it to, because decolonization is also about the mind frames and the mindsets that we've adopted or have been forced into by colonization, which includes seeing land as property. So it might not be that the land belongs only to Indigenous peoples, and I'm seeing this just as a discussion, but more that we're starting to think more about stewardship of the land, different ways of relating to the land, shifting our worldviews around the land altogether. So I think that needs to be an integral part of any discussion of decolonization, and how that actually looks again with funding or donors or nonprofits. I'm not exactly sure, but fundamentally it has to be about that. And going back to what Nikki said so beautifully, is kind of bringing together two groups that were kind of foundational to colonialism and colonization, which were Indigenous peoples and Black people as well. So looking back to the history of transatlantic slavery as part of that history of colonialism, as part of the genesis of capitalism, those are two groups that were very much harmed, and many others, of course, in the development of that system. So thinking about that as restitution, as reparations, needs to be part of that conversation. And reparations, I think, as the discussions are taking place in the US, always has to go hand in hand with discussions of land back, which I don't think is as prevalent or necessarily given the same amount of space as reparations in the States.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I just want to push this a little bit further. To the best of my knowledge, we haven't seen any philanthropic institution give land back in Canada. That's not a thing. We don't see announcements about land back given here, land back given there. Why aren't we seeing that? And tangibly, if we can get as close possible, what could that look like? Is it land trust? Yeah, Jonas, go for it.
Oh, I think it starts with the Income Tax Act of Canada, of course. I think removing the fact that charities in Canada are allowed to register as an advancing religion is absolutely wild to me. And the fact that those organizations or foundations that self-identify as advancing religion, 80% which are Christian-based faith organizations, control around $15 billion in assets and around another 7 to 10 billion in land assets. Go directly after them. These are the same institutions that are responsible for colonization and the implementation of these residential schools. Talk is cheap. If the federal government wants to get serious, make those reforms.
Anybody else want to chime in on that?
I just want to say thank you for that point about returning versus giving land back. I think that's an important distinction. So thank you, Samantha.
I think the only short point I can make here is that we're nowhere near this realization, right? We're just nowhere near it because we have barely tipped our toes in the water of having this conversation. And as was pointed out earlier, those with the greatest wealth in this country are not even central to the conversation or in the conversation. So I almost don't even want to engage in this discussion because there is so much acknowledgement that needs to happen. And there is such a gulf between what we're talking about and what needs to happen before we get there. So I feel that that gulf is so deep that a lot could just fall through. And we need to be building some sort of a bridge in order to get there. And maybe that's what this conversation is and needs to be, is having that bridge built so that we can begin to actually have that kind of honest truth telling conversation.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paulette. Maybe I then want to shift to a question about power. So, it has come up many times that a very few number of people hold so much power in this sector. But I think it doesn't need to be that way. I think it's interesting to conceptualize the relationships between bosses and workers in a similar way as we might think about funder and fundees. And how do workers go about seizing power back from the boss? It's engaging in collective organizing and collective action. We see that in strikes, for instance. I'm curious for you guys to engage with the question of how might grantees, how might communities that they work with take some of that power back and use some of these ideas around land back. If nonprofit professionals, if sector professionals are already there, it's just their institutional leaders who aren't. How can nonprofits, take power back and move this discussion on a wee bit faster?
Well, I'll jump in. I think that it's a great question. I think part of it is that, the social sector and nonprofits and charities, it's such a large piece of the pie. Like in the United States, you're talking about 13%, right, of our economy. So it's massive. And so one of the things I think is important in these conversations to locate the percentage of that we really understand, to be really thinking about, not just thinking about, but actively working inside of with communities. And I would dare to say that's a pretty small percentage relatively. So just to locate things, right? But that said, I think a big piece of that is actually activating conversations about what power building is. Because I think that a small percentage of institutions are really actively engaged in that conversation, right? And I think that is really to go from just a conversation, but then to the act of taking power, that's a leap. And I think that's sort of the first thing we have to actually reconcile with, is actually being sure that we're empowering individuals that work inside of these institutions to really grapple with what it means to actually do some power building. And from there, I think there's real opportunity to sort of take back power. I also think that there's a way of reframing this a little bit, because, I try not to think about philanthropy and funders having power over me, right? I think that's sort of like a mindset shift that has to begin also, because quite frankly, philanthropy is just an example of how there's concentration of power in our economy broadly, right? And so as nonprofits and charities, philanthropy might be where we're most proximate to. But I think so much of that is even reframing it and thinking about what are opportunities for us to organize collectively. How can we build economic models together that actually really underscore and emphasize the values that we have? How do we do some brokering of exchange of resources, right? And things of that nature. and that is something, again, I think having the conversation about what power building actually means and what that can mean for your institution as individuals has to begin. I think oftentimes when we have these conversations, we assume that, I'm accepting for those on this panel and those who are attending, that everyone's on the same page on that and has an understanding of that. And I think that can be such a massive influx of power building in the sector, but it does have to begin somewhere, of almost like a, like a treatise of some sort, a framework that can actually bring us together. So, I mean, just to kick off the conversation, I'm sure there's other perspectives.
Jonas, go for it.
Yeah. All right. So there's two things. First thing is for us as an organization, when we do accept granting fund, not only are we a granting organization, we do receive funds from partners. And we're very clear with the foundations or the philanthropists that reach out to us about what are the minimum thresholds of us accepting those funds, right? So we only accept multi-year agreements. We only accept funding from a certain threshold, right? We're very, very clear to those partners and funders about what reporting, monitoring, evaluating we will be doing and what work they should be doing as funders. So that's the first thing. In terms of the second thing on power, I think I was very clear in my panel session. I don't believe in the sector's ability to transfer power to our communities. Time after time, they've demonstrated poor leadership here. We're in a perpetual cycle of stupidity in this sector. And until the federal government of Canada actually steps up to make these changes, nothing's going to really get done. We're just going to be moving stuff around, right? It is a responsibility of the 86,000 charities in this country to step up and speak up with a forcefulness that we have never seen in Canadian history, right? 2019 was when the restrictions on not-for-profit advocacy were removed. I understand we were in a pandemic and not a lot of people were able to strategically take advantage of that, but this is the moment now. If we don't step up now, right, with a federal, provincial, and municipal election coming up in this country, then we only have ourselves to blame. You pay for what you buy, right? And if we do not advocate strongly on our community's behalf, if these institutions that have true power, particularly major cultural institutions and national not-for-profits, if they do not step up and speak up, then we're just going to be in this cycle again. And then a year from now, we'll be having the exact same conversation about transforming resilience funding. Right. And that's the conversation I want to have.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think that's really bold that you guys are pushing back with some of the funders and saying this is what we are willing to do and this is what we're not. I think there is also potentially exciting power in fundees coming together and making those statements collectively, because there can be risk in acting as an individual actor. Any nonprofit is working on behalf of so many people, and it's a scary thing potentially to say no to funding that's going to support them to do the work they want to do, but perhaps more power working together. Paulette, I saw your hand up. Do you want to jump in on that too?
Yeah, I just wanted to further elaborate on what Jonas is talking about in terms of the tool of advocacy, the tool of using your voice, and the silence of our sector, right? And even when we thought we could advocate, we weren't really advocating, right? And now that it's been lifted and it's clear, the fear of doing that because of what happened in the past when folks did is still very present. And so there's some work around what that could look like within the sector. And I think that the subsector of the feminist movement in Canada has demonstrated how effective that can be. We've had some successes, particularly in terms of funding for various aspects of gender equality work. And that's gone fairly well over the past year, especially during this pandemic, where we have not let up on this federal government in terms of funding the capacity and the the needs of the sector in order to be able to respond to the pandemic. And what we expect going forward is that this will only increase, because what's been demonstrated over the past year and some is that without our sector, without the entire charitable sector, it saved lives during this pandemic, and we know that. And so I think it's incumbent on us to utilize the voice of what we are supporting and seeing and working on the ground in order to create that sea change that needs to happen. And if we don't do that, then we'll continue be trapped in this imbalanced power relationship where we are seen to be begging and receiving what we get, as opposed to saying, unless you are funding what's needed, we don't actually want your money, right? Or because it's also about being relevant. Mm. And I am really happy for the moment we're in, not because of the devastation it's created, but because of the opportunity to actually do a reset. Because what we had before was entirely created. And so we can actually utilize our collective power to create something entirely different.
Great. Thanks for bringing that up, Paulette. That's great. I want to shift maybe next to one of the questions that has come in the chat. And apologies, folks, there are so many great questions. I'm only going to be probably choosing a few, but I am trying to read each one. So thank you so much for sending those in. This one is from Haley. She said that she was really moved by Kosi Sochikup's presentation. And in particular, she is wondering about how do we encourage organizations to model organic, community-driven decision-making based on honest, authentic conversations, not just as a one-off occasion, but as an ongoing practice that we look to continuously evolve as an organization. So not these one-off conversations, but rather funder and fundee engaging in mutually beneficial learning. Kosi Sochikup, I don't know if you want to, kick us off there as a starting point.
Yeah, definitely as a starting point, I'd love to hear other folks on this panel's thoughts on what I shared and how that can kind of be implemented within the sector. But for me, I'm still struggling and I'm still trying to take what I was able to develop through that experience into my work. And I think that's where you start to run into the issues of working within an institution, within a bureaucracy, and all of the different kinds of restrictions that are in place. And as a Black woman working within the government, there are its own challenges that are there as a young Black woman working within government. And I've always been kind of lucky to have champions who have supported me and allowed me to take risks within government as well. And that includes really bringing in people who are never heard. So I remember when I was working with my team last year, I reached out to a scholar and I was able to bring her and 3 other grassroots activists to give a presentation to our entire directorate on the intersections between race and racism and the social economy. And they were super happy to be part of that conversation because these are discussions that they had been wanting to have with the Canadian government that they had not been able to. So I'm trying in the ways that I can, but again, these are, this is kind of like a learning curve. And I think it's also important to mention that, like, even though I'm not like a senior exec or anything like that, there are ways that at whatever levels that we are able to kind of create seeds of change and to kind of be a champion for change more broadly within an organization. So I'll leave it at that, and I'd love to hear what anyone else has to say. Oh, last thing is, that's what I try and do within government or within institutions like that. And I also try my best to be active outside of those spaces. And I find that it's really outside of those spaces that I'm able to effectuate the kind of change that I want in terms of building and sustaining organic relationships. So I'm taking what I'm learning from outside and again, trying to have a feedback loop that helps me to bring all of that back inside.
Seems we've lost our host. So we could continue the conversation. I don't know.
It looks like Ron's dropped off there. It's all good. Yeah. Gina, we haven't heard from you yet. So I'm just really curious about your take on a couple of things that we've heard so far. And in particular, curious about some of what you're seeing across the different country contexts you work in around how power is shared and how relationships are changing.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I feel like I'm a bit of fish out of water because I don't know the Canadian context well enough to give specific.
We're looking to learn from you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this kind of like Bronwyn sort of intimated to this question, like, what could donors do to seed power, right? And it's funny, I was taking a walk with my brother in the woods and our dogs the other day, and I was kind of ranting, and I was thinking, if I were a donor and there was a question I did not know the answer to, I would just sort of basically give, a blank slate, to whoever wants to try and solve it, right? So if the question is like, which combination of interventions really combats white supremacy, right? Or how much plastic is there in the ocean, right? Or how do you actually combat misinformation? Like, if you don't know the answer, then it would be extraordinary if donors could allow an enormous amount of open-ended exploration, experimentation, room for failure, room for diversity in the way you achieve that. I mean, this could be just a simple compact that we agree on. If you know the answer, fine, we should just execute, right? And we should be good stewards of public money, and that's fair. But if you can't answer it, then open it up. Silent snaps. Bronwyn is back.
Oh, Bronwyn's back. All good, Bronwyn?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, okay.
Good old internet surge, yeah. Are we ready to move on to a next question? Is that the natural place in our conversation?
Yeah, we can keep going. I just heard some really interesting points from Gina, if someone wants to add to what Gina said, terrific. If not, there's the questions from the audience, which are super interesting. So we can get into those. Yeah.
One just quick. Can I just say one quick thing? Because obviously I don't know the Canadian context either, being based in the U.S. But something, Gina, to your point about, if you don't know, I think so much of it is that very few people actually do know. In particular, the world does change. And when we think about the fact that, philanthropy is really about allocating resources. And in terms of the practice of the position, not what it actually means. It actually means love of humanity and all those sort of things, right? But when I think about this goes back to my earlier comments, and I'm sure has been said before, that when individuals and institutions that are making decisions on where resources go actually don't represent the communities themselves, you're bound to have, which was said earlier, this perpetual state of stupidity, I think was said earlier. And I think that's just something that has to consider. I can speak to this on a US context. It has to continuously be reinforced. There's so much opportunity to actually shift who has power in these institutions. It's so much harder to do that on the other side, on the individual side, because we have these radical wealth disparities that are grounded in all sorts of historical contexts, I'm sure was addressed earlier today. But there are opportunities to actually shift who's in power, not just an individual, not single individuals, because as the point was raised earlier, you don't have to be an executive. There's leadership that shows up in so many different ways, but it's really fundamentally about the leaderfulness. And so I think that's actually one point I consistently, again, from the US context, I can speak to. You have to change who gets to decide. You have to change that. That in and of itself will make sense. It will be imperfect, but we're living in worse than imperfection right now. And so I think that is another piece that I would just consistently elevate.
Great. I saw one question that came in from the chat that was sort of a loop back to our previous conversation about sort of organizing amongst nonprofits to push back against some, not so great funder practices, or just what we want, what nonprofits want to be doing as opposed to what funders want them to be doing. The question was is there a natural body to convene that organizing? And so I guess I'm curious, like, what would that look like? Like, does that look like nonprofits who are all grantees of an organization, like just calling each other and like knowing each other better? Like, what does that, does that look like the Ontario Nonprofit Network, like being a convening space? Like, what does that tangibly look like? How can folks go about doing that work? Paulette?
So I think it's beyond convening, and which is the natural body. I really think it's about being willing to enter into a whole new conversation, a whole new space of actually talking about what we've been doing and what we haven't been doing, and how in fact collectively perhaps we have failed, and the results are make up the evidence of that failure, right? So I've been in the nonprofit space for decades in Canada. I have been on both sides of the fence, you know, of receiving and grant making. And whether it's a mainstream organization doing the work or giving the money, we have historically failed in this country to address what the pressing problems are, right? And I think there's a point at which we don't cry about it, we accept it, right? We accept it. And in accepting it, it's about then being able to move to a different type of conversation that informs the work that we're doing, that can show up in the results in terms of what we're trying to create. I think that is the task ahead of us now. Conversations are happening. It's happening in Black communities. It's happening in Indigenous communities. It's happening across communities. The pandemic has sped up a lot of those conversations to be happening, making sure monies are getting where they need to be, although we have some work to do there, right? But I think it's about really being able to accept that perhaps we haven't been doing as good a job as we thought we were or wanted to do. And if that's the case, how then can we collectively actually change that trajectory? Because if lives continue to be lost, if Black kids continue to fail at 40% in the school system, if Indigenous kids continue to be, the residential school system is now within it's been switched, right? You know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah,
so, right, the child welfare system, right? That's what we have in this country. And I suspect it's not just in this country, right? So if that's the case, and we said that we are the sector that does good, how good have we been doing if the least among us are continue to suffer in this way, right? This is not, it's not okay. It's no longer okay. It's never been okay, and it's no longer okay to accept that.
Yeah, Kwasi Kwarteng.
Sorry. I just wanted to pick up on a point in the chat. So this is from Irwin, and they're saying structural change comes from impacted communities, not from a professional class. And one thing I wanted to mention when we were talking about power and how to seize power and so on is the ways in which, like, if we look at the amount of funding that goes to Black-led organizations, to Black serving organizations, that means that there's a lot of people who are being left out of this sector. And I think it's always a good reminder to go and look at the ways in which they're sustaining themselves. And for me, that has been, you know, learning about things like Isusus, or I'm trying to remember what they're called in different communities. Paulette, do you know what they're called elsewhere?
Partners in Jamaica, Susu in Trinidad.
Exactly. So for me, that has led to discussions with my own mom about how she's used Isusus in the past when she's had issues with money, when she needed a little bit more support. And she's told me to like use an Isusu to help pay off loans, and I'm now in an Isusu. So there are ways in which we should be paying attention to what exists and what is being used, because those communities have always been excluded, unfortunately. And that means that if they're still here and they're still surviving somehow, they have built their own systems. So how can we go in and how can we support? And I don't know necessarily like how exactly, you know, what the federal role, for example, would be there, but how can we actually learn more about these systems? How can we find a way to partner? And I think about the work of Dr. Carolyn Shanaz Hossain, who was the academic that we brought in to speak to us. And she's been doing research in this area for years, right? And she's been trying to bring attention to Black-led cooperatives, right? Esusus are separate from that, but can lead to that in a way. So just, yeah, that point made me think of that experience as well.
And just for folks who might not be familiar with that model, can you describe really briefly like what that looks like?
Sorry about that. Yes, I can describe it. So essentially, Esusus is it's often led by women within a community. So it's a kind of system that operates under different names across the African continent, but also elsewhere. And basically, you have a group of people come together, and each person contributes a hand, and a hand essentially is a sum of money. And each meeting, they might not actually be physical meetings, but each meeting, one person leaves with all of the hands. So they take the entire pot of money, and it becomes, if you're first, it becomes a kind of loan where over consecutive meetings, you pay back that loan by giving back that hand. But it's a way of pooling funds, of pooling savings, and providing funding to someone who might not have it. Mutual aid, yes.
Brilliant, brilliant,
And,
thank you.
and it's multi-generational. I've been doing that since my eyes are at my knees. So multi-generational.
So good.
And that's why this is so powerful, and thank you for introducing this, because I think so much of this is, I mean, that concept that structural change doesn't happen from the professional class, it comes from the impact of people. I always think I've been thinking so much about the tension that I have as, you know, a leader in a not-for-profit institution, and what that means in terms of like structural change, right? Because things like mutual aid, if you look at, when I think about the U.S. construct, if you look, there's history of structural change being led outside of non-for-profits. A cynical reading of it could also be, and there are many that subscribe to this, that both philanthropy and the not-for-profit infrastructure was an intentional design to sort of mute, right? Not completely silence, but mute, have some level of control over structural change and change making. And so one of the things I think about is like, what is our role as not-for-profit institutions that can actually make sure that we're investing in things outside of our you know, a professional, more professionalized structure to enable more change, right? What are the pathways for that? And again, it goes back to my earlier point about, you know, I don't, my experiences demonstrate to me that not every charity or not-for-profit is like subscribes to the conversation that we're talking about, right? And so, you know, what are the pathways that we need to be able to, you know, pave, and or not even pave them, but actually invest in that already exist, for us to actually see more of that structural change that can happen outside of the not-for-profit construct.
Yeah, big gulf between settler institutional philanthropy and all of the mutual aid practices that folks are doing in communities to survive. Yes, I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on that, and to what degree, you know, there actually is a desire for institutional philanthropy to like be directly supporting mutual aid networks. Like the main way that I conceive of institutional philanthropy supporting people to like survive is this funneling money into social service organizations, which I think Jonas has really sort of clearly named. Like maybe that's government's role, maybe that's not necessarily the role of nonprofits to be doing long term. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on that sort of like mutual aid institutional philanthropy gulf.
Oh, they'll never do it because of control and direction. For being honest here with ourselves, it won't happen. Again, Income Tax Act of Canada, guys. We need to focus on that.
Got it.
Although I will, just to add, just because when everybody was talking, it got me thinking. We should also be mindful of our international responsibilities here as Canadians. We have over the past few decades, we've significantly underinvested our official developmental assistance targets. We have significantly underinvested in our bilateral relations, and it was reflective on Canada when we applied for a United Nations security seat and lost. We have a significant damage in terms of Canadian reputation overseas, the type of investments that we are making, the type of extraction that we're implementing, and the type of performance aid support that we're doing globally. The philanthropic sector, with over $85 billion in assets, could and should be stepping up more to fill those gaps that the federal government of Canada has. MasterCard Foundation recently did about a $1.1 billion donation for COVID vaccines that we were hoarding. Maybe hoarding is a Canadian characteristic, but we need to really focus on our international commitments as well.
I just want to point out that hoarding is a uniquely American, cultural thing too. So we have that in common.
We're just learning. We're just learning from you guys.
Yeah, Gina, I don't know if you want to jump in on that, sort of the responsibilities for, global care as one way to name it. No. Okay, fair enough. I saw a question come in.
Listening and taking it all in at the moment, so no, thank you.
I saw a question come in the chat. It's a quite specific conversation about the disbursement quota, how much each year foundations have to give out. The question asks, why set the minimum at 10%? Why not base it on the performance, the investment performance of the foundation in that year? Some funds may not make a 10% return and thus would have to cut into their principal. And this person says a blanket minimum DQ, does not address these variations in investment performance.
Rhonda, you go ahead first.
All right. Well, I'll try to do this really quickly. It's a fascinating question. I do think that it does open the door for or it sort of closes the door on the question of, do these institutions need to be perpetual to begin with, right? So my piece on that is that I consistently think it should just be higher and higher and higher, and that we should not assume, because again, we're talking about power. There's no reason because someone made a ton of wealth at some point that the wealth can be concentrated in perpetuity. Maybe there could be some policy designs, for example, that could transition that wealth into community-based institutions that operate outside of the philanthropic infrastructure, so that you could actually have economic power that folks can exert themselves versus relying on institutions, philanthropic institutions.
I was going to say the exact same thing, but he said it in a much nicer way.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if one of you wants to jump in. Another question in the chat is bringing up the question of what foundations are actually invested in that is enabling them to earn such high rates of return. In the US, in my mind, there is a more developed ecosystem of Black-led cooperatives that are creating opportunities for not just Black-led, but more businesses that are rooted in the values of reciprocity and solidarity, less extractive in nature. I guess I'm curious sort of what you folks think in terms of what it might take to see in Canada more businesses that foundations are able to invest in, and more funds that are truly rooted in the values that you folks are talking about.
Yeah, the Circle on Indigenous Philanthropy has done pretty good job in research on this. The other 95%, I believe the report was called. So I recommend everybody check that out. But, we have a fundamental problem in the sense that we don't have an adequate definition of what impact investing is, or what social financing, or what these type of investments should be, right? So first things first, I think we need to figure that out as a sector and a community. And then number two, so we can avoid making investments in, is Shell trying to, is Shell, the oil company, trying to make internal investments to meet, their targets, or to invest in forms of reforming the extraction sector, is that considered impact investing? Is that a social investment? Is that an ESG type of investment? These are the type of questions that need to be figured out first. Once you figure that out, I think a lot of fund managers, investment managers, family offices, and they're like, will push back and say, well, we need enough time to do this. Well, it's, we can't take money out of the markets like this, or, a list of excuses. Set a deadline, set a target. And if you don't hit that target or don't meet that target, the federal government should tax you. I see somebody writing a comment around that. Should the mission line become taxable? Absolutely, if they do not by a certain threshold, right? Why are we resistant to make these bold, creative type of decisions, right? Our mediocrity in this country is rooted in denialism that we are suffering, that communities are suffering, and that this money is rooted in that suffering.
I wanted to say enough said.
Okay. Yeah, enough said, question mark, fair enough. I also am seeing an interesting comment in the chat here that maybe, Gina, you might be able to weigh in on. There's a question from Shannon. Shouldn't we be re-examining the way aid is funneled between nations? A lot of aid funding is problematic in nature and perpetuates inequality. So I guess, like that as an important statement, and then maybe a broader question of like, how might individual philanthropic organizations do international mutuality and solidarity support in a values-aligned way?
Well, you're really throwing me all the tough ones, aren't you, Ron?
That's how I'm proud. Yeah, there we go.
No, I think it's a good point. I mean, I think many in the ODA sector know that its days as is are very much numbered, either due to reasons that countries are turning inward and focusing, particularly with the pandemic, particularly when the economy is shut down and supply chain is shut down, and you saw a lot of more insular thinking. So it's certainly the case that that may be coming to an end. I think it's a very good point, though, to say maybe it should be coming to an end for other reasons, because of the way it's channeled, because of the way it's managed. There are countless challenges with that one. Did you want to come in, Jonas? Go ahead. No, it's okay. That being said, I mean, from where I sit, essentially, in 2015, the governments of the world and the Pope and Shakira all came to New York, and they made some promises. They said that they were going to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030, and that they were going to eradicate HIV/AIDS and take climate action steps, and achieve universal basic education and eliminate the gender gap in education. And the truth is that right now we are very much not on track to make those things happen. Global poverty is rising for the first time in like 20 years. And, malaria rates in sub-Saharan Africa are something like, 100% higher than they normally would be. There's massive delays in delivering on those promises that all the governments of the world made. And we don't have that much time. We've got 8.5 years. So that being said, more generosity is needed. And it, whether it comes from philanthropy or, overseas development assistance, or we find another creative way of doing it, there are huge needs. And we gotta level up.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gina. I'm just looking at the time, and I think that probably rounds out our time for the plenary discussion. Thank you all so much for your provocative commentary, your insightful commentary. This has been a real pleasure. And also, I just want to note that Nikki was supposed to be with us for this portion, but her Wi-Fi dropped, and so she wasn't able to reconnect. So that is unfortunate. And we are now going to throw over to Rodney for our last keynote of the day, before then doing a quick round of final reflections and closing it out. So Rodney, over to you.
Wonderful, thank you. Honestly, at this point, because there was such a great conversation, I'm like, man, I wish we could just continue the dialogue, because so much of the topics that we discussed are so pertinent to, what I want to get across. So one, I'm thankful for the time and the opportunity to share words with such a great group of exceptional leaders. I think what I want to like really hone in on with the time that I have remaining is around the concept of power. And I'm kind of flipping the script a little bit given the conversation that we just had, but I think it's really important because I captured some really insightful comments in the chat. And one of the things that I understand is that, or that I believe that I understand, is that this entire conversation has been about power. And I know there was a comment around not trying to have like this dichotomy between charities and funders, et cetera. And I think that's an incredible, insightful comment to make, that it shouldn't be an either or versus. And the thing is, the system has, in fact, set it up that there are massive inequalities and discrepancies in power, right? And so fundamentally, what that means is that there's going to be an antagonistic relationship, given that some have power that has been extracted from them, resources that have been taken. That's why I really appreciate that comment about not giving away, but returning land back and resources and whatnot back to those that have been extracted from. And I know it's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but it's oftentimes we have these conversations wrapped up in, and I understand the intent of it around generosity, good spirits, well intentions, good intentions in that nature. But I can say that none of those things fundamentally shift the systems that we all live in and that we live through. And so when I think about being the leader of our organization, Common Future, and just to reiterate that, because many of you might remember us as the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, because we had a pretty strong presence in Canada. I entered into an organization that was predominantly white-led institution, very well-intentioned, and quite frankly, I can give all due credit to my predecessor for really paving the way for someone like myself, a Black man, to enter into the organization and then reprioritize everything that be around racial and economic injustice. Really, how do we mobilize resources? How do we shift power? How do we shift capital and power to those that have been most impacted by injustice? And that was a pretty radical act. And this is one of the things I was pointing out in the plenary earlier, is that the simple fact of allowing space for someone like myself and then bringing in others with similar experiences and an agenda to really prioritize the interests of extracted communities fundamentally change the way that we operate as an organization. I don't think it would have occurred in the same way with the previous leadership. And that's not to say that they were not well-intentioned, that they weren't generous people, but it's a very different conversation when someone like myself and my colleagues actually have fundamental power over the direction of our institution. And so seeing that significant shift from at an organizational level, and you can hear it in the commentary from those who've spoken today or in the plenary, it's really clear why that's important. And so when we talk about power, one's at an institutional level, but then I think about the conversation that we just had and the opportunity that is before us. And I can only speak from the US context, but what is before us to actually build power, not just within institutions, but across institutions. And I love the points earlier. I do not assume that anything will be given up, that any one thing will be ceded to, that we need to build it on our own and build it where we can. And so fundamentally, what are the opportunities for not-for-profits and charities to really be able to build economic power? And I keep saying economic power because that's the way that you can actually, within the systems that we live in, capitalism was raised earlier, these different exploitative structures, that is a way, whether it's a mutual aid, whether it's in different forms, the cooperatives that you can exert power. And getting outside of the traditional construct of the not-for-profit ethos, not being reliant upon funders and donors to really get us forward, because I think that fundamentally strips us of our power. And so one of the things that we think about a lot at Common Future, one, we have this remarkable network. We prioritize leaders of color and those that have been most impacted by issues, by the systems, and allocating unrestricted resources to them, resources that enable them to think, to imagine what could be different. That's fundamental, like giving up even our relative positional power to others, sharing that with them. But then the other side of it is, how can we co-create and build new infrastructure? New infrastructures, really, that can actually work outside of the mainstream system that we all operate within. And so to give you an example of that, it's a small example, but one of the things that we're working on at Common Future is impact investing came up as a piece of conversation. We don't like to use that language, but I understand why it was brought up in that way. We talk about shifting capital, right? We talk about just like moving money, shifting capital and power. And so one of the things we recognize, as we all know, is that institutions that are led by people of color, particularly women of color, really don't have access to capital and power. And so we're working with 3 organizations, all Black and Indigenous women-led institutions in the Common Future Network, working with them to build a cooperative financial infrastructure in which they will be able to allocate capital into their communities as they see fit. What's interesting about this is that, one, Common Future has put capital into it, but also we've been able to raise co-investment from others and effectively told them that what we need to do is actually listen to the organizations that we're working with. I need you to cede power and your own financial interests to these institutions and building some cooperative infrastructure so that they can actually build the power that they want, actually allocate resources in the ways that they believe they need to do best. And I use that example of, one, us leveraging our institution, the power that we hold, to share that power with other institutions. And I think one of the biggest reasons we're able to do that so easily is because, again, we're predominantly people of color organization. We believe in these institutions. We don't have to be convinced of it. We don't have to be yelled at and cajoled and agitated to do it. We fundamentally believe in these folks because we feel like we're a part of that community too. And then leveraging, not only sharing that power, but then going to others and saying, you can invest in these folks in the same ways that we've invested into them. And really sharing that as an insight, because we don't actually believe that everyone's going to actually see, as I said earlier, that we have to actually go to and come in as partners. And which goes back to my fundamental point as well about building your own economic power as an institution, particularly, and I'm specifically speaking to those that are predominantly led by folks that are actually impacted by the issues or have some direct relationship to the issues. That is fundamentally a shift, because by going to funders and donors, et cetera, with some action, financial infrastructure and resources, some power, the whole conversation shifts pretty dramatically. Because you're not seen as, I think the comment was made earlier, that we're going to beg from funders and donors, but it's actually seen as someone who's investing alongside of. And so I actually, again, this is why I consider that power building in institutions and across institutions is so important, that particularly those of us who are in positions where we can share power and we actually understand and have intimate relationship to all these injustices. One, we have a responsibility to step into it, but we also have a responsibility to make sure that we don't give people an out that don't. And I think this is fundamental. And I think this is what a lot of the conversation earlier about was about, in terms of, will people cede, will institutions cede? Don't make an excuse, don't make an assumption that it will happen, but I do think that we can't give excuses for those either. And so with that, those would be my final comments. And I appreciate having the opportunity to speak.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rodney. That was great. Our last order of business, before we close out, we're going to hear from each speaker 30 seconds on what's one thing that we all should be taking away as a thing to do within the next 12 months to action one of the things that we've heard. So Nikki, of course, is not able to join us. So first we're going to go to Paulette for her thoughts.
I was hoping to say what he said, but since I can't do that, I will say do your inner work in terms of what you need to do personally, but also the organizational work, like the learning that needs to happen so that your decisions can be based on that learning. I'm pretty fortunate to work in an organization, Canadian Women's Foundation, where we question that every day. We question the decisions that we're making, and we admit to the areas that we fail in, and then we do our best to make a better decision the next time. So that we're not leading with reputation or credibility, we're leading with understanding. And so I think that that's an important thing, and that I don't think it's only up to my board. I think it's up to us, no matter what positions we hold in the organization, as Kosi mentioned earlier, and that ideas can come from anywhere, and challenges and opposition can come from anywhere. And so we need to take the time to listen and do that. So that's what I will say.
Thanks so much, Paulette. Kosi Sojiku, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for what you said. And just to build upon that, I'm constantly thinking about the ways in which I can make room for other people, including when that means taking a step back or taking a step away, and really creating a space for someone else to come in and use that space in a way that I can't per se. So I think that goes into what Paulette said about doing that inner work. And sometimes that inner work means identifying the areas that might be weaknesses for you, or the ways in which you've learned things that might be harmful or extractive. And understanding that to relearn or to unlearn and to relearn different ways means that you have to take a backseat. So that's something I try and do in the work that I do in government, and I'm constantly thinking about that.
Thank you so much. Next, we are over to Jonas.
I'm going to cheat a little bit and say two things. First one is for funders to implement trust-based philanthropy as the basis of all their work. Point blank, simple, very straightforward. And for the non-for-profit sector to step up and speak loud, get loud, get creative, right? We are in a moment of change. Let's seize it.
Brilliant, thank you. Next, over to Gina.
Thank you so much. I just keep thinking about this quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a prison abolitionist, who says, the future already exists in fragments and pieces and experiments and possibilities. And I would just, whatever your position is, I have found that, labeling something an experiment means you can kind of move forward with it without necessarily all of the power structures in place that you might need to really make transformational change. So make the future and do experiment.
Beautiful, thank you. Rodney, do you want another last word, or did you give us 7 minutes of your last word?
I feel like I gave more than 7 minutes of my last word, but I will say this, because I said it earlier. For foundation specifically, I really want you to think about your own perpetuity, because I think there could be a transition from philanthropic perpetuity and one in which you can actually help to create and invest in perpetual community wealth building for those that have actually been most impacted by these injustices.
Thanks, Rodney. Yeah, and I'm next just going to pass it over to Vinod to close us out. I would strongly encourage you, though, to stick around for a minute. There's going to be instructions on how to participate in tomorrow. It's going to look a lot different to today. And if you don't stick around, you might show up and wonder how the heck is this all working? So listen to the man with the plan for instructions for tomorrow.
Thank you, Bronwyn. What an incredible day one. We've heard sort of throughout today's keynotes that what we're talking about isn't new. But these practices, and certainly the pandemic, has left us with exacerbated inequities, tremendous loss, and a new depth and breadth of problems. But it has also shown that social change can look, feel, and be different. But as all of our speakers have reminded us today, it's up to us. Our present worldviews, relationships, and inactions are compounding into the future we'll get. 1, 2, and 5 years from now. So what I'm sort of taking away really is that, what you and I demand, decide, reject, work on, and vote for in conversations, in meetings today determines what happens tomorrow. So massive thank you to Jenna, Nikki, Paulette, Kosi, Jonas, Gina, Rodney, and Bronwyn. The exchanges, the conversations today had so much energy, tension, connection, learning, unlearning, and empathy. So thank you so much again for your provocations, your presence, and your wisdom. And a huge thank you to our partners for making this happen. United Way Centre Canada, Community Foundations of Canada, the Muttart Foundation, Suncor, and E180. These organizations have huge ambitions for a better society and better sector. And also a huge thank you to the Future of Good team, starting with our programming lead, Katie, but also Jenna, Julie, Kylie, T, and Bren. And to all of you changemakers, hope you've gained valuable insights and perspectives for your work. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow for a full day of all kinds of brain dates, one-on-one brain dates, group brain dates. And to tell us all about it, I'll now turn it over to Katie Miller.
Thanks, Vinod, and thank you everyone for being here today. We've really enjoyed the discussion, and as mentioned, this is not it. We're still going to be continuing the discussion tomorrow, where we'll be meeting through Brain Dates, which is a really exciting platform that allows you to set up one-on-one meetings or group discussion based on questions or themes that you want to continue to the dialogue on. You can present questions you're still holding, or maybe areas of expertise that you want to share with others. These can really be framed as expertise sharing or jam sessions for you with other participants. We've been putting it in the chat throughout this event, and it will be in a recap email that is sent to you right at 4 o'clock. But you can sign up through Brain Dates by just going to their website, putting in the activation code Future of Good. And since just being in our discussion today, we've seen a jump of 150 plus participants in there and 30 discussion topics that are already there that you can sign up for. Some of those are looking like, what does justice-based funding look like? How do we save humanity? Just a small question, that one. It's going to be a really exciting day tomorrow. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you on Brain Dates tomorrow. If you are yet to be convinced on the power of Brain Dates, I'm just going to show you a short video about how it works that you can watch on our way out. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for all joining us. We're really excited again for your participation, and the conversation doesn't end here. We will be sharing the recording with all of you, as well as some recap articles from the team. So you'll hear from us shortly.
Just Katie, before we move to the video, just a quick note on our day one survey, correct? Where would participants find the link to that?
That's in the chat, and Jenna will put that in one more time.
Okay, super. Thank you so much.